There was a world before this one, a civilization that rose when the earth was younger, and then it vanished. Completely. Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. But stop. What happened before that first word? What does the silence hide? 12,000 years ago, something reset everything. Ice melted, oceans rose, and every trace of what came before was swallowed. The book of Enoch was removed. Jubilees was suppressed. Why? What truth did they contain that Genesis could not? 200 cultures, separated by oceans, all telling the same story. A flood, watchers from the sky, and giants. Beneath the ocean floor lie cities, structures that should not exist, built with precision we cannot replicate today. The Nephilim were not simply giants. The Hebrew reveals something else, something the translation deliberately obscures. Methuselah, Enoch, Lamech, 10 generations. But what if their names are not names? What if they are coordinates? The Mayan calendar counts backward, beyond their civilization, beyond Sumer, to a date 12,900 years ago. Egypt's Kentia Mentiu, the first ones, pre-dynastic beings who ruled before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before memory. The Younger Dryas, a cosmic impact that ended the Ice Age in days. Not myth, geological fact. Uruk, the first city, but its foundation stones were already ancient when the Sumerians arrived. Who built them? The Watchers taught metallurgy, astronomy, agriculture. Knowledge that should have taken millennia to develop appeared overnight. What if Genesis is not the beginning? What if it is the restart? What came before the word? You open the Bible, the very first words stare back at you from the page. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1, verse 1. But stop right there. Beginning of what, exactly? What happened before this supposed beginning? The text offers no explanation, no context, no prelude. It simply begins, as if nothing existed before, as if history itself was born in that sentence. Now think about this carefully. Every ancient civilization recorded its origins. The Sumerians documented kings who reigned for thousands of years before the flood. The Egyptians traced their dynasties back to the gods themselves. The Babylonians preserved creation epics that predate Moses by centuries. Yet the Bible, the supposed chronicle of all creation, starts abruptly without acknowledging any of this. Why? What is the silence protecting? The Hebrew word used in Genesis is bereshit. It doesn't actually mean in the beginning in absolute terms. It means in a beginning, suggesting there were other beginnings. Something came before. The scribes who compiled Genesis knew this. They had access to the same Mesopotamian tablets we're only rediscovering now. They read the Epic of Gilgamesh. They studied the Enuma Elish. They knew about Eridu, the first city according to Sumerian records, built in the year 4500 before Christ. So why did they choose to remain silent? Here's where it gets disturbing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in the caves of Qumran in 1947, contain fragments of the Book of Giants. This text describes a world before Adam, populated by beings the Bible barely mentions. Giants walked the earth. Hybrid creatures roamed. Advanced knowledge existed. Then something catastrophic happened. Something so terrible that the entire record was erased. The biblical authors didn't start with creation. They started after the destruction. Imagine the scene carefully. You're a Hebrew scribe in Babylon during the exile, around the year 586 before Christ. You're surrounded by ziggurats and libraries filled with ancient texts. You read accounts of pre-flood civilizations with technology and wisdom that seemed almost divine. You discover that your own ancestors borrowed stories, adapted myths, reshaped legends. Do you preserve this uncomfortable truth? Or do you create a new beginning, a clean slate that positions your God as the sole creator, erasing everything that came before? The Sumerian king list records 8 kings who ruled for a combined total of 241,000 years before the flood. Think about that number. Even allowing for exaggeration or different time measurements, these texts point to something vast and ancient. The Bible compresses all pre-flood history into roughly 1,600 years, from Adam to Noah. Entire epochs vanished. Civilizations were reduced to footnotes or eliminated entirely. The question isn't just what was hidden. The question is, why was it necessary to hide it? The Book of Jubilees, considered scripture by Ethiopian Jews, but excluded from most Bibles, provides what Genesis omits. It speaks of tablets written by Enoch that contained all knowledge from before the flood. It describes angels who descended and shared forbidden wisdom with humanity. It chronicles wars between bloodlines that the canonical text barely mentions. This wasn't lost accidentally. This was removed deliberately. Someone decided you shouldn't know. Hold that thought. Because if the beginning wasn't really the beginning, then everything that follows exists on top of something else. A foundation we're not allowed to examine. A history too dangerous to remember. And somewhere in the ruins of Ur, in the clay tablets of Nineveh, in the fragments hidden in Vatican archives, the true story waits. The story of what God himself may have wanted forgotten. The story of who walked the earth before Genesis said, "Let there be light," and why their existence had to be swallowed by silence so complete that even asking these questions feels like trespassing on sacred ground. Genesis 6, verse 4. 14 words in English, 22 in Hebrew. The entire foundation of one of history's most disturbing cover-ups compressed into a single breath. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Now stop. Read it again. Does that sound like a complete thought to you? Or does it sound like someone desperately trying to summarize something they don't want you to fully understand? The word translated as giants is Nephilim in Hebrew. But here's where everything you think you know begins to unravel. Nephilim doesn't mean giants. The root word is nephal, which means to fall. The Nephilim aren't the tall ones. They're the fallen ones, or more accurately, the offspring of the fallen ones, the sons of those who came down. Now ask yourself this. If they were just unusually tall humans, why would the text need to distinguish them with such a specific, almost technical term? Why would their existence require an entire flood to erase them? The Book of Enoch, removed from the biblical canon in the 4th century, tells a radically different story. Not 2 verses, not a footnote. 108 chapters of detailed, methodical documentation. Enoch names them. 200 angels called the Watchers descend to Mount Hermon. Their leader is Semjaza. His lieutenants include Azazel, Arakiel, Ramiel, Kokabiel, Tamiel, Ramiel, Danel, Ezekiel, Barakiel, Asael, Armaros, Batariel, Bezaliel, Ananiel, Zekiel, Semsapiel, Satariel, Turiel, Jomjel, Serial. 20 names. Not myths, not metaphors. Names with linguistic roots that scholars can trace across Sumerian, Akkadian, and pre-Babylonian texts. These weren't divine messengers on a spiritual mission. They taught. Enoch chapter 8 lays it out with disturbing precision. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, breastplates, all instruments of war. Arakiel taught the signs of the earth. Barakiel taught astrology. Kokabiel taught the constellations. Ezekiel taught knowledge of the clouds. Arakiel taught the signs. Shamsiel taught the signs of the sun. Sariel taught the course of the moon. Imagine the scene carefully. Advanced beings transferring technical knowledge to Bronze Age humans who still thought fire was magic. Does that sound like benevolent education, or does it sound like weaponization? But here's what the church doesn't want you connecting. More than 200 flood myths exist across cultures separated by oceans they couldn't have crossed. Sumerian king lists describe rulers who reigned for thousands of years before the flood swept over. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written centuries before Genesis was compiled, tells of Utnapishtim building an ark with exact dimensions eerily similar to Noah's. Mayan Popol Vuh describes sky beings descending and creating hybrid creatures that had to be destroyed by water. Hindu Matsya Purana recounts Manu surviving a catastrophic deluge sent to cleanse corruption. Greek myth preserves Deucalion's flood. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories speak of sky ancestors and purging waters. Coincidence? Or fragments of the same censored event? The Nephilim weren't just physically different. Genesis 6 verse 5 follows immediately. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth. Not the wickedness of the Nephilim. The wickedness of man. Humanity had been contaminated. The Hebrew word used is ra, implying not moral failing but fundamental corruption, genetic level pollution. Whatever the Watchers did, whatever they taught, whatever they bred into the human line, it required total erasure. Not reformation, not correction, annihilation. Now here's the question they buried under centuries of mistranslation. If God is all-knowing, why didn't he stop the Watchers before they descended? Unless stopping them was never the plan. Unless humanity needed to be tested with forbidden knowledge. Unless the corruption was always meant to reveal something darker about what we truly are when given the choice. And those Nephilim didn't all die in the flood. The genealogies in Genesis chapter 5 are presented as historical records. 10 generations from Adam to Noah. Each patriarch lives for centuries, then dies. The numbers are precise. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912 years. Methuselah, the oldest, lived 969 years. The text treats these figures as literal chronology. But here's what they never told you. Ancient Sumerian king lists discovered in the 1920s describe rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years. The Mesopotamian tablets predate Genesis by at least a millennium. They record 8 kings before the flood, not 10 patriarchs. The lifespans are exponentially longer. King Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years. King Allogar ruled for 36,000 years. These aren't metaphors or symbolic numbers. The scribes recorded them with the same administrative precision they use for grain inventories and tax records. Now place these two documents side by side. The structure is identical. Both list rulers before a catastrophic flood. Both present lifespans, far beyond normal human experience. Both culminate with a flood survivor who builds an ark. The Sumerian version names him Ziusudra. The Akkadian version calls him Atrahasis. The Babylonian version names him Utnapishtim. Genesis calls him Noah. Are we looking at 4 different stories, or one story told 4 different ways? Here's where the mathematics become disturbing. Scholars in the 1800s began calculating backward from known historical dates. Using the genealogies in Genesis, they could theoretically date the creation of Adam. Bishop Ussher famously calculated the year 4004 before Christ. But archaeological evidence demonstrates advanced civilizations existing thousands of years before that date. Egyptian dynasties, Mesopotamian city-states, the walls of Jericho dated to 8,000 years before Christ. The chronology doesn't just fail to match, it collapses completely. What if the numbers were intentionally reduced? Think about this carefully. The Sumerian kings lived tens of thousands of years. The biblical patriarchs lived hundreds of years. Someone systematically compressed the timeline. The Hebrew word toledot appears 11 times in Genesis, always introducing genealogies. But toledot doesn't simply mean generations. It means accounts, records, origins. These are administrative documents, the kind that get edited, the kind that get revised by scribes with specific agendas. The Book of Jubilees, removed from most biblical canons, provides different numbers entirely. It divides history into Jubilee periods of 49 years each. It adds details the canonical Genesis omits. It names the wives of the patriarchs. It describes technologies and cities that suddenly appear without explanation. Most importantly, it records 10 generations that were completely erased from the biblical account. 10 dynasties that ruled between the flood and Abraham, centuries that vanished like they never existed. Methuselah becomes the key to unlocking this erasure. His name in Hebrew contains a prophecy. His death shall bring. Calculate the years carefully. Methuselah was born in the year 687 after Adam. He died in the year 1656 after Adam. Genesis chapter 7 verse 11 tells us the flood came in the 600th year of Noah's life. Do the mathematics. Methuselah died the exact year the flood began. His death triggered the judgment. But here's what makes no sense. If Methuselah was the oldest man who ever lived, why does Genesis devote only 2 verses to him? No stories, no teachings, no significance beyond his age. Adam gets chapters. Noah gets chapters. Abraham gets chapters. Methuselah gets his birth year, his death year, and nothing else. It's as if someone tried to erase him but couldn't remove him completely without destroying the chronology. His name had to remain because the numbers depended on it, but his story, whatever kingdom he ruled, whatever knowledge he possessed, was systematically deleted from the record. 3 ancient texts outside the biblical canon claim Methuselah wasn't a man at all, but a title for an entire dynasty that governed the world before the flood. The floodwaters rise in Genesis chapter 7. 40 days and 40 nights, the text tells us. But when you examine the geologic record, something doesn't align. Sediment layers across 6 continents reveal catastrophic flooding that occurred simultaneously, not gradually. Marine fossils discovered 14,000 feet above sea level in the Himalayas. Petrified forests buried under miles of sediment in Antarctica. Cities submerged beneath 300 feet of ocean water off the coasts of India, Japan, and Cuba. These aren't anomalies, they're evidence. Now stop and think about this carefully. The Bible claims Noah's flood covered the entire earth. But what if civilizations already existed before that water rose? Advanced societies with knowledge of astronomy, metallurgy, and architecture that wouldn't be rediscovered for millennia. The Sumerian king list, dating back to the 26th century before Christ, describes cities that flourished before the Abzu, their word for the Great Deluge. 8 kings ruling for a total of 241,000 years. The numbers seem absurd until you realize they're not metaphorical. They're chronological records that someone wanted erased. Guarda esa pregunta. Because here's where the contradictions become impossible to ignore. Genesis chapter 6 says, God saw wickedness and decided to cleanse the earth. But the Epic of Gilgamesh, written 500 years before the oldest biblical manuscripts, tells the identical story with one crucial difference. The gods didn't flood the earth because of human sin. They flooded it because humanity had become too numerous, too loud, too advanced. Tablet 11 describes Utnapishtim building an ark with precise measurements nearly identical to Noah's. Same dimensions, same animals, same mountain where it landed. But the Sumerian account adds something Genesis conveniently omits. The gods regretted the flood immediately after because they destroyed the very civilizations they had helped build. Imagina la escena with forensic precision. Coastal cities spanning hundreds of miles, suddenly engulfed. Not primitive villages, urban centers with harbor systems, metallurgical workshops, astronomical observatories. Marine archaeologists discovered the Gulf of Cambay structures off India's western coast in 2001. Geometric patterns, grid layouts, artifacts carbon dated to 7,500 years before Christ. That predates the biblical flood by nearly 2 millennia. What does that mean? It means either the flood happened much earlier than Genesis claims, or these cities survived something the Bible refuses to acknowledge. The Maya recorded it in the Popol Vuh, a great flood sent by the heart of sky to destroy the wooden people, the failed first creation. The Egyptians described it in the Edfu text as the collision of 2 serpents that caused the primeval waters to consume the island of the egg. The Hopi speak of the end of the third world by flood, when the spider grandmother saved the righteous in hollow reeds. More than 200 flood myths across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. Same cataclysm, same timeline, different explanations for why it happened. Coincidencia? Or the fragmented memory of an event so traumatic that every surviving culture embedded it into their origin stories? But here's what they're not telling you in seminary. The Hebrew word used in Genesis 7 for flood is Mabul. It appears only in the flood narrative, nowhere else in the entire Hebrew Bible. Scholars have traced its linguistic roots to Akkadian and Sumerian terms, meaning not just water, but cosmic upheaval, catastrophic restructuring, a deliberate reset of planetary conditions. The text isn't describing rain, it's describing something atmospheric, geological, astronomical converging simultaneously, something that required foreknowledge. Now everything begins to escalate. Because if Noah knew the flood was coming, someone told him. Genesis 6, verse 13. God warned him. But the Book of Jubilees, removed from the biblical canon in the 4th century, provides the missing context. It wasn't God who warned Noah first. It was the Watchers, the same rebellious angels from Enoch, who revealed the coming destruction to their hybrid offspring. They taught humanity to build underground shelters, to preserve seeds, to encode knowledge in stone that water couldn't erase. The flood wasn't just divine judgment, it was a cover-up, an attempt to bury the evidence of what had been built, who had built it, and what knowledge they possessed. And beneath those flood waters, that evidence still waits. The fallen angels brought gifts, not salvation, not wisdom in the spiritual sense. They brought metallurgy, astronomy, weaponry, cosmetics, and botanical medicines that should not have existed for thousands of years. The Book of Enoch, chapter 8, verse 1, names them explicitly. Azazel taught men to make swords of iron and shields and breastplates. Shemihaza taught enchantments and root cuttings. Armaros taught the resolving of enchantments. Barakel taught astrology. Kokabel taught the constellations. Chezekiel taught the knowledge of clouds. Imagine technology descending from the heavens into a Bronze Age world, unprepared for its consequences. The Hebrew term is chokhmah, wisdom, but not the moral kind. This is technical knowledge, craft knowledge, the secrets of manipulating matter itself. Genesis 6 says the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and took them as wives. But that sanitized version erases what Enoch reveals, a deliberate program of technological transfer. 200 watchers descended on Mount Hermon and made a pact, an oath to corrupt humanity with forbidden sciences. Why would angelic beings need to swear an oath unless they knew the act was transgression? And why does the canonical Bible reduce this cosmic rebellion to 2 verses, while ancient Judaism preserved the full account in texts that were later declared heretical? Stop and consider the implications. If pre-flood civilizations possessed advanced metallurgy, they possessed foundries, mining operations, trade networks, perhaps even early forms of writing to record formulas and techniques. The Sumerian king list describes antediluvian rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years over cities we are only now rediscovering beneath sediment layers. The Epic of Gilgamesh mentions the Apkallu, 7 sages who brought civilization's arts before the flood. The Egyptian texts speak of the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, who ruled in a golden age before recorded history. The Vedic traditions describe the Saptarishis, 7 sages who preserved knowledge through cataclysm. More than 300 flood myths across every inhabited continent, and nearly all of them mention beings who taught humanity before the waters came. Now here is where everything escalates. The Watchers did not just teach randomly. Enoch chapter 8 reveals a pattern. Each angel specialized in a domain of knowledge. Azazel focused on weapons and warfare. Penemu taught writing, which the text says led humanity into error through ink and paper. Think about that. Writing itself is listed as a corrupting gift. Why? Because it allowed the preservation and transmission of the other forbidden sciences. Gadriel taught the art of cosmetics and ornaments, which the text links directly to vanity and sexual corruption. Kazdeja taught humanity about the smiting of the embryo in the womb, ancient abortion techniques. These were not gifts of enlightenment, they were calculated corruptions, each designed to pull humanity further from its intended path. Archaeological evidence is beginning to align with these dismissed texts. The Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman shipwreck, is an astronomical calculator from the 2nd century before Christ, with gear mechanisms that should not exist for another 1,000 years. The Baghdad battery, dating to the Parthian period, suggests knowledge of electrochemical cells. Precision-cut megaliths at Pumapunku in Bolivia display tolerances of less than 1 millimeter across blocks, weighing hundreds of tons. Conventional archaeology has no explanation. But what if these are echoes, remnants of technologies taught in the antediluvian world, and partially recovered by post-flood civilizations, who found the Watcher's legacy buried beneath the mud? The canonical Bible edited this history into oblivion. Church councils in the 4th century, after Christ debated which texts were inspired and which were dangerous, the Book of Enoch was used by early Christians, quoted in the Epistle of Jude, referenced by church fathers, yet ultimately excluded. Why eliminate a text that explains Genesis 6 with such unsettling clarity? Because it revealed something the emerging orthodoxy could not accommodate. That humanity's fall was not merely spiritual disobedience in a garden, but technological contamination on a species-wide scale. And if the flood was sent to cleanse that contamination, then what fragments of it survived the waters? The official Bible you hold today contains 66 books. Detente un segundo. In the 4th century, church councils debated over more than 80 additional texts. Some were read in churches for centuries. Others were venerated as sacred scripture by entire Christian communities. Then they vanished, not lost by accident, but removed by design. Coincidentia? Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. The official narrative claims this gathering unified Christian doctrine. But look closer at what actually happened. Bishops gathered from across the empire, each bringing their own sacred texts. Some collections included the Shepherd of Hermas. Others revered the Gospel of Thomas, the Epistle of Barnabas, the Apocalypse of Peter. These weren't fringe documents. They were mainstream scripture for millions of believers. Yet within decades, they would be declared heretical. Guarda esa pregunta. The selection process itself remains suspiciously undocumented. No official minutes survive from Nicaea regarding which books made the final cut. Later church historians offer conflicting accounts. Some claim divine inspiration guided the bishops. Others admit political pressure determined orthodoxy. Athanasius of Alexandria issued his famous Festal letter in 367, listing exactly which books Christians should accept. Any text not on his list was to be purged. Why did one bishop in one city possess the authority to erase centuries of sacred tradition? Now think about what those excluded texts actually contained. The Book of Enoch offered detailed genealogies of the Watchers. It named each fallen angel and specified what forbidden knowledge they transmitted. 1 Enoch chapter 6 verses 1 through 8 lists exactly 200 angels who descended on Mount Hermon. It identifies Semjaza as their leader, Azazel as the teacher of weaponry, Amazarak as the instructor of sorcery. This wasn't vague mythology. These were specific historical claims. And the early church fathers quoted Enoch extensively. Tertullian defended it. Clement of Alexandria cited it as scripture. Even the canonical Epistle of Jude, verses 14 through 15, directly quotes 1 Enoch chapter 1 verse 9. So why was Enoch ultimately banned? Imagina la escena con cuidado. A Christian community in 3rd century Syria gathers for worship. They read from the Gospel of Thomas, which contains sayings of Jesus not found in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Saying number 77 records Jesus declaring, I am the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood. I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. This is radically different theology. It suggests Christ's presence permeates physical matter itself. It implies knowledge hidden within creation. The canonical Gospels never make such explicit statements. ¿Por qué la Biblia guarda silencio sobre esto? The Book of Jubilees provides precise chronologies that contradict Genesis. It claims angels taught Noah's sons the secrets of medicine using plants. Jubilees chapter 10, verses 10 through 14, describes how demons began afflicting Noah's grandchildren after the flood. Noah prays for protection, and God commands the angels to bind 9/10 of the demons, but leave 1/10 free to tempt humanity. This detail appears nowhere in canonical scripture, yet Jubilees was considered authoritative by the Essenes at Qumran. Multiple copies were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Communities preserved it for centuries. Then church authorities declared it apocryphal. But hey, algo aún más perturbador. The excluded texts don't just add details, they fundamentally alter the narrative. The Gospel of Mary presents Mary Magdalene as the disciple who understood Jesus' teachings most deeply. The Apocalypse of Peter describes multiple heavens and detailed visions of judgment. The Shepherd of Hermas outlines a complex angelology with specific functions for different celestial beings. These weren't minor variations. They represented entirely different understandings of reality, salvation, and humanity's cosmic position. Someone decided those understandings were too dangerous to survive. Now everything begins to escalate, because the suppression didn't end with simple exclusion. Possessing banned texts became a capital offense under certain Byzantine emperors. Libraries were searched, manuscripts were burned, scribes who copied forbidden books faced execution. This wasn't theological housekeeping. This was systematic erasure of alternative knowledge. And here's what haunts the historical record. We only know about many excluded texts because church fathers wrote refutations of them. The originals are gone. We're left with fragments, quotations, and condemnations, scraps preserved by accident. ¿Qué quería Dios ocultar? Or more precisely, what did men claiming to speak for God decide humanity shouldn't know? The canon was closed. The boundaries were set. But the excluded texts whisper from the margins, describing realities the official narrative could never contain. And buried within their forbidden pages lies evidence of what the institutional church could not allow to exist. The ancient Egyptians possessed knowledge that should not have existed. Their pyramids stand as monuments not just to architectural ambition, but to precision that defies our understanding of primitive civilization. The Great Pyramid aligns to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a single degree. Modern engineers with laser theodolites struggle to match that precision. How did workers with copper chisels and wooden sledges achieve what our technology barely replicates? But here's what they don't tell you in museums. The Egyptians themselves claim they didn't build these structures alone. Pause for a moment and consider the inscriptions at the Temple of Edfu. These texts speak of the Zep Tepi, the first time, an epoch when divine beings walked the earth and established civilization, the gods who came before. The Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus, were described as intermediaries between the divine realm and humanity. Egyptian chronology records their rule extending back tens of thousands of years before the first pharaohs. Manetho, the Egyptian priest who chronicled his nation's history in the 3rd century before Christ, documented dynasties of gods and demigods ruling for millennia. Mainstream scholarship dismisses this as mythology. But what if these records preserve actual history that the biblical narrative deliberately erased? The deity Khentiamentiu offers a doorway into this forbidden past. His name translates as foremost of the Westerners, the Lord of Abydos. Ancient texts describe him as ruling over the realm of the dead, but also as a primordial being from before the current age of humanity. Temple inscriptions at Abydos, one of Egypt's oldest sacred sites, reference him as belonging to the first race of beings who inhabited the earth. Not the first humans, the first race. Do you see the distinction? The pyramid texts, among humanity's oldest religious writings, speak of a time when the gods physically governed from their thrones in Egypt. These weren't metaphorical rulers. The text describes specific lineages, specific technologies, specific knowledge systems. Now think about this carefully. The Papyrus of Ebers, a medical document from approximately 1550 BCE, contains remedies and surgical procedures attributed to the ancient wise ones who came before. It references anatomical knowledge that shouldn't exist in the Bronze Age. Descriptions of the circulatory system, pharmaceutical compounds requiring chemical processes. One passage explicitly states these healing arts were gifts from those who ruled in the time before memory. Before memory. What civilization thrived in an era so ancient that even the Egyptians of 3,000 years ago considered it lost prehistory? Egyptian construction presents even deeper mysteries. The temples at Karnak incorporate stone blocks, weighing over 300 tons, fitted together with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. The unfinished obelisk at Aswan weighs nearly 1,200 tons, carved from solid granite. Modern cranes max out at roughly 900 tons of lifting capacity. Geologist Robert Schoch demonstrated through erosion analysis that the Great Sphinx shows evidence of water weathering, suggesting construction dating back to at least 7,000 BCE, possibly earlier. That places its origin in an era when mainstream archaeology insists only primitive hunter-gatherers roamed the earth. Who possessed the engineering capability to move mountains of stone with such precision? And why does the Bible, which meticulously catalogs the histories of neighboring peoples, maintain absolute silence about Egyptian achievements that should have been contemporary with the patriarchs? Here's where the timeline completely fractures. According to biblical chronology, Abraham entered Egypt around 2000 BCE. By that point, the pyramids had already stood for centuries, possibly millennia. The Sphinx gazed across the desert long before Abraham's birth. Yet Genesis never mentions these impossible monuments. Not once. Moses, raised in Pharaoh's court, educated in all the wisdom of Egypt according to Acts chapter 7 verse 22, writes the first 5 books of the Bible. He would have walked past the pyramids. He would have studied in temples covered with inscriptions about the gods who came before. He would have known the Egyptian accounts of antediluvian civilizations. But the Pentateuch remains silent. Why would Moses omit what he certainly witnessed, unless he was commanded to suppress what he knew? The Egyptian priest historians recorded something the biblical authors refused to acknowledge. There were sophisticated civilizations before the flood, and some of their knowledge survived. But someone decided that history needed to be forgotten. And now we need to ask what else was buried beneath the sands alongside those impossible monuments. Imagina un amanecer sobre las arenas de Irak en 1929. Un equipo alemán excava bajo el sol implacable. Lo que encuentran reescribe todo. No hallaron primitivas chozas de barro. No encontraron evolución gradual desde la barbarie. Descubrieron Uruk, una ciudad que simplemente apareció completa, perfecta, imposible. Detente un segundo y piensa en lo que eso significa. La arqueología convencional nos vende una narrativa cómoda. El hombre primitivo avanza lentamente, inventando herramientas, descubriendo el fuego, construyendo refugios toscos. Generaciones enteras pasarían antes de concebir algo parecido a la civilización. Pero Uruk contradice esa historia completamente. Calles trazadas con geometría exacta. Sistemas de irrigación que requerían comprensión hidráulica avanzada. Escritura cuneiforme ya desarrollada, no balbuceos gráficos de principiantes. Astronomía que calculaba ciclos lunares con precisión moderna. Y aquí está lo perturbador. No hay versión 1.0. No hay borradores fallidos. Los textos sumerios no atribuyen estos avances a genio humano. El Enuma Elish, escrito en tablillas que preceden a Moisés por siglos, habla claro. Los Anunnaki, seres descendidos del cielo, construyeron las primeras ciudades. No es metáfora poética. El texto enumera nombres, fechas, linajes. Describe cómo Enki, señor de las aguas profundas, impartió el conocimiento de la construcción. Cómo Anu ordenó la fundación de centros urbanos antes de que el hombre dominara el lenguaje. Coincidencia que la Biblia mencione a Nimrod como constructor de ciudades en esa misma región, en Génesis capítulo 10, versículo 10? ¿O estamos viendo dos versiones del mismo evento prohibido? Pero hay algo aún más inquietante que la arqueología prefiere ignorar. La Torre de Babel aparece en Génesis 11 como castigo divino por ambición humana. Dios confunde las lenguas, dispersa a la humanidad. Fin de la historia. Excepto que las tablillas sumerias cuentan algo diferente. Hablan de Etemenanki, la casa de la fundación del cielo y la tierra, construida no por rebeldes humanos, sino como templo para seres que descendían físicamente. 7 niveles, cada uno dedicado a un cuerpo celeste específico: Mercurio, Venus, Marte, Júpiter, Saturno, la Luna, el Sol. Conocimiento astronómico imposible para pastores nómadas. Las dimensiones de Etemenanki, registradas en la tablilla de Esagila, coinciden con descripciones posteriores de la torre bíblica. ¿Por qué la Biblia transforma un templo funcional en símbolo de arrogancia castigada? ¿Qué verdad se está ocultando bajo la moraleja? Ahora piensa esto cuidadosamente. Uruk no fue la primera. Los propios sumerios admiten heredar su sabiduría de otra fuente. Textos como la lista real sumeria mencionan reinados antes del diluvio, que duran miles de años. Ciudades que existieron cuando la realeza descendió del cielo. Eridu, más antigua que Uruk, aparece en inscripciones como primera ciudad de los dioses. Excavaciones en Eridu revelan niveles que datan del sexto milenio antes de Cristo, 6000 años antes de Abraham, 8000 antes de Cristo. Y aún así, los niveles más profundos muestran planificación urbana sofisticada. No hay capa primitiva. Guarda esa pregunta sobre Eridu, porque los textos mesopotámicos insisten en algo más radical. Hablan de ciudades anteriores sumergidas, conocimiento preservado tras el cataclismo. El mito de Ziusudra, el Noé sumerio, no termina con un arco iris y promesas. Termina con los dioses otorgándole vida eterna y llevándolo a Dilmun, tierra donde el cuervo no grazna. Una tierra previa. Una civilización madre. La Biblia edita esta parte. Reduce el relato a obediencia y supervivencia. Pero los sumerios preservaron lo que Génesis borró. Que antes de Babel, antes del diluvio, existía algo que no debemos recordar. Y aquí es donde el silencio bíblico se vuelve ensordecedor. Si Uruk apareció completa, si Eridu predató toda cronología aceptable, ¿qué ciudad aún más antigua yace bajo las aguas que los textos antiguos tanto temen nombrar? Los mayas no deberían haber existido. No con ese nivel de precisión matemática. No en medio de la jungla centroamericana, aislados del resto del mundo civilizado. Cuando los españoles llegaron en el siglo XVI, encontraron algo que desafiaba toda lógica. Una civilización que medía el tiempo en ciclos de 256.000 años. Piensa en eso, 256.000 años. ¿Por qué una cultura necesitaría medir periodos tan vastos? ¿Qué estaban calculando? El Códice de Dresde sobrevivió a las llamas. Fue uno de los 4 manuscritos mayas que escaparon de la quema ordenada por el obispo Diego de Landa en 1562. De Landa destruyó miles de textos que llamó obras del demonio. Pero ese único códice preservado revela algo extraordinario. Los mayas no solo predecían eclipses solares con exactitud absoluta, calculaban el ciclo sinódico de Venus con un margen de error de 2 horas en 500 años, sin telescopios, sin instrumentos ópticos. ¿Cómo? Ahora detente un segundo. Esa precisión requiere observaciones continuas durante siglos. Generaciones de astrónomos registrando datos, transmitiendo conocimientos sin interrupción. Pero los mayas no tienen registros de esa acumulación gradual de saber. Aparece completamente formado en sus primeros textos. Ya perfecto. Aquí es donde el silencio bíblico se vuelve ensordecedor. La Biblia nunca menciona estas civilizaciones del otro lado del océano. Nunca reconoce culturas midiendo eras geológicas completas. El relato de Génesis comienza con Adán hace aproximadamente 6000 años según cronologías tradicionales. Pero los mayas están calculando ciclos que retroceden cientos de miles de años. ¿Coincidencia que la Biblia limite su narrativa temporal? ¿O censura deliberada de una cronología más antigua? Guarda esa pregunta. Los mayas hablaban de 4 soles previos, 4 edades del mundo que terminaron en catástrofes. El Popol Vuh detalla cómo cada humanidad anterior fue destruida y reemplazada. La primera raza fue hecha de barro, se disolvió en agua. La segunda de madera, ardió en fuego. La tercera casi lo logró, pero los dioses la aniquilaron por arrogancia. Imagina la escena con cuidado. Estas no son metáforas vagas. Los textos mayas proporcionan fechas específicas, Duraciones exactas de cada era. El último gran ciclo terminó en 1987 según algunas interpretaciones. El ciclo actual comenzó hace más de 5.000 años, pero los ciclos anteriores se extienden hacia atrás, capa tras capa, hacia profundidades temporales que la cronología bíblica nunca admite. Ahora piensa esto. Más de 200 culturas en 6 continentes preservan mitos de humanidades previas destruidas. Los griegos tenían 5 edades, los hindúes sus yugas, los persas sus milenios cósmicos, los aztecas repiten la misma estructura de 4 soles que los mayas. Ninguna de estas culturas tuvo contacto documentado antes del siglo XV. Océanos las separaban, cordilleras montañosas, desiertos infranqueables. ¿Cómo todas desarrollaron idéntica cosmología de ciclos catastróficos? ¿Memoria colectiva de eventos reales? ¿O herencia de una fuente común más antigua? La estela maya de Quiriguá registra una fecha. Es la más antigua tallada en piedra en Mesoamérica. La inscripción retrocede 90 millones de años. 90 millones. No es error de transcripción. Los epigrafistas lo han verificado repetidamente. ¿Por qué grabar fechas tan antiguas? ¿Qué evento estaban conmemorando? Los mayas llamaban a esos tiempos remotos los días de la creación. Pero no la creación del universo, la creación de esta versión del mundo, esta humanidad, este ciclo. Y aquí es donde todo comienza a escalar. Los textos mayas no están solos. El libro de Enoc describe 7 generaciones antes del diluvio, con conocimientos astronómicos imposibles. Los Vedas hindúes calculan yugas de millones de años. Los sumerios registran listas de reyes con reinados de 30.000 años. Todos midiendo tiempo en escalas geológicas. Todos recordando eras anteriores. Todos silenciados por el canon bíblico establecido en el siglo IV. Pero permanece la pregunta que nadie en Nicea quiso responder. Si estas culturas separadas por océanos y milenios todas recuerdan lo mismo, ¿qué verdad antigua compartían que la Biblia decidió no preservar? 12,800 years ago, something fell from the sky. Not a metaphor, not divine wrath in poetic language, something physical, massive, traveling at velocities that turned ice into steam in microseconds. The evidence lies scattered across 4 continents in a geological layer, so precise you can measure it with calipers. Iridium concentrations spike. Nanodiamonds form only under extreme pressure, and heat appear in sediment cores from Pennsylvania to Syria. Megafauna across 2 hemispheres vanish simultaneously from the fossil record. And here's what they don't tell you in standard geology courses. Over 300 flood myths from cultures separated by oceans describe this exact moment with unsettling specificity. Now think about what that means. The Hopi speak of the third world ending in flames and water. The Aztec codices describe the destruction of the fourth sun by celestial fire. Australian Aboriginal traditions recount when the sky fell and the great waters rose. These aren't vague creation stories passed around campfires. They contain details, the direction of the blast, the sequence of destruction, even the time of year. The Younger Dryas boundary layer confirms what oral tradition preserved, a cosmic impact that reset human civilization to zero. But here's where it gets disturbing. The Bible fragments this singular catastrophe into multiple disconnected narratives. The flood of Noah, the fire that consumed Sodom, the plagues of Egypt. What if these weren't separate events, but shattered memories of one apocalyptic moment? Guarda esa pregunta, because the physical evidence is undeniable now. In Greenland ice cores, you can see the exact year when temperatures plummeted by 15 degrees in less than a decade. Across North America, a black mat layer contains the charred remains of forests that burned simultaneously across millions of square kilometers. Mammoths in Siberia froze so rapidly that buttercups were still in their mouths, preserved for 12 millennia. The impact theory explains what gradualist geology cannot. Why advanced settlements like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey were deliberately buried around this time, as if survivors were hiding something. Or hiding from something. The site predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, features astronomical alignments no hunter-gatherer society should comprehend, then suddenly gets entombed under tons of dirt. Detente un segundo. Consider what survives in biblical text. Genesis 6 describes the Nephilim, giants who walked the earth in those days and also afterward. Job 38 has God asking, "Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation?" As if addressing someone who should remember but doesn't. Psalm 74 mentions God crushing Leviathan's heads, breaking up the fountains and floods. These aren't metaphors for spiritual concepts. They're geological memories encoded in religious language. The Hebrew word mabul, used for Noah's flood, appears nowhere else in Scripture. Scholars trace it to Akkadian abubu, meaning a catastrophic deluge of cosmic origin. The text itself tells you this wasn't normal rain. And here is where everything escalates. Because cultures with zero contact describe identical sequences. First comes fire from above, then darkness for days or weeks, then floods as ice caps melt catastrophically. The Popol Vuh of the Maya. A great flood was made which fell on the heads of the wooden creatures. The Atrahasis epic from Babylon. The Anunnaki lifted up their torches, setting the land ablaze with their flare. The Book of Enoch, removed from canon. The stars fell from heaven and the earth trembled. Same event. Different storytellers. Different continents. Identical details. Coincidencia? Or the last testimony of a world that watched itself end? But if advanced civilizations existed before the impact, who were they? What did they know that required 12,000 years of silence to erase? Words are not innocent. They carry memory. They preserve what civilizations tried to bury. When you examine ancient Hebrew, something impossible emerges from the linguistic archaeology. The language shares root structures with Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian. Not just borrowings, deep grammatical DNA, as if these languages descended from a single mother tongue that predates them all. The Tower of Babel suddenly looks less like parable and more like historical record. What unified language did humanity speak before the scattering? Consider the Hebrew word yada. It means knowledge, but context transforms it. Genesis 4, verse 1 states, Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived. The word is yada. Knowledge becomes carnal intimacy. Why? In ancient understanding, these weren't separate concepts. To know was to merge with, to possess completely. The Gnostics understood this. Their entire theology revolved around forbidden knowledge as transformative union. The serpent in Genesis 3, verse 5 promises, "You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." That word again. Yada. What kind of knowledge makes humans divine? And why was it forbidden? Linguists have documented over 300 Sumerian loanwords in biblical Hebrew. 300. The creation narrative in Genesis uses the word tehom for the deep waters of chaos. This is not generic Hebrew. It's a direct cognate of Tiamat, the primordial chaos goddess in the Enuma Elish. The Babylonian creation epic predates Genesis by at least 1,000 years. Moses didn't invent this story. He inherited it. He adapted it. He sanitized it for monotheism. But the original words betray the older source. The linguistic fossils remain embedded in the text like dinosaur bones in sedimentary rock. Now think about this carefully. The Hebrew word Elohim is plural. Gods, not God. Yet it takes singular verbs in Genesis 1. In the beginning, Elohim created. Created is singular. The grammar is deliberately broken. Ancient Hebrew scholars call this the plural of majesty. A convenient explanation. But Psalm 82 preserves something older. God stands in the congregation of the mighty. He judges among the gods. Elohim judging Elohim. The text accidentally reveals what editors tried to conceal. The original cosmology was polytheistic, one supreme being presiding over a council of lesser deities. The Canaanite pantheon featured El as the high god with 70 sons. Israel worshipped Yahweh as one among this council, before monotheism hardened into dogma. Egyptian linguistic fingerprints appear throughout the Pentateuch. The name Moses itself derives from Egyptian, not Hebrew. It means son of, or born of, appearing in Thutmose, Amos, Rameses. The Ark of the Covenant mirrors Egyptian sacred barks that carried divine images. The term mercy seat translates kaporet, cognate with Egyptian KPR, meaning to purify or atone. Even the Ten Commandments echo the Egyptian Book of the Dead's negative confessions. I have not killed, I have not stolen, I have not committed adultery. The moral framework Israel claimed as divine revelation existed in Egypt for over 1,000 years prior. Did Moses plagiarize? Or did all these cultures drink from an earlier well? The Mayan language preserves the word hunabku, meaning the one giver of movement and measure, a monotheistic concept in a culture supposedly isolated from Old World influence. Their term for sacred knowledge, zuvuya, means the circuit of return, knowledge as cyclical revelation, like yada, like gnosis, separated by oceans, divided by millennia, yet speaking the same conceptual language. Linguistic convergence on this scale defies coincidence. It demands a common origin, but there's something even more disturbing hidden in the vocabulary of catastrophe. Every ancient language possesses multiple distinct words for flood, deluge, inundation. Hebrew has mabul, used only once in all of Scripture, only for Noah's flood, a unique term for a unique event. Sumerian has amaru, Akkadian abubu, Greek cataclysmos, Sanskrit pralaya, all technical terms, all indicating not seasonal flooding but cosmic reset, as if every culture needed a special word for the unthinkable. The word that describes the moment the old world drowned and the new one began gasping on the shore. And in every language, embedded in the syllables themselves, lies a date, a time marker, pointing backward to the moment when everything humanity knew was erased. The question is whether we're willing to read what the words are screaming. The silence ends when patterns converge. For 11 chapters, we've traced forbidden lineages, lost cities, cosmic catastrophes, linguistic bridges between civilizations that weren't supposed to meet. We've watched how Scripture fragments a coherent story into scattered verses, how apocryphal texts preserve what canonical editors removed. Now ask yourself this. If all these threads connect to a single suppressed history, why would that history stay buried forever? What if the very beings who initiated this cycle are preparing to complete it? The Book of Enoch doesn't just chronicle the past, it encrypts the future, and that future is unfolding now. Enoch chapter 13, verses 1 through 3, records something extraordinary. The watchers who descended, who taught forbidden knowledge, who corrupted humanity before the flood, they begged Enoch to intercede on their behalf. They knew judgment was coming. But here's what makes your skin crawl. Enoch chapter 15, verse 2, records God's response. The watchers would be bound beneath the earth for 70 generations. 70 generations, not forever. Calculate that duration using the biblical lifespan metrics from Genesis. Depending on whether you count pre-flood or post-flood generations, 70 generations lands you somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years. The Book of Enoch was written approximately 300 years before Christ. Do the math. We're past the release date. Guarda esa pregunta. Because multiple ancient sources describe the same temporal boundary. The Sumerian king list speaks of divine beings who ruled before the flood, then withdrew. The Egyptian texts from Dendera describe cycles where the gods return to reclaim dominion. Mayan codices calculate the end of long count cycles with precision that aligns eerily with our current century. These aren't primitive superstitions. These are coordinated chronologies pointing to the same window in time. Our time. You can dismiss one culture as mythological fantasy, but when 17 separate civilizations, separated by oceans and millennia, encode the same timeline, coincidence stops being plausible. Something else is operating here. Now look at Revelation chapter 9, verses 13 through 15. 4 angels bound at the river Euphrates, prepared for a specific hour, day, month, and year. Not random, scheduled. The text doesn't say they've been there since creation. It says they were prepared, past tense, passive construction, for a predetermined release point. Cross-reference that with Jude verse 6. Angels who didn't keep their proper domain, reserved in everlasting chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. Again, until. Temporal language. The scriptures aren't describing permanent imprisonment. They're describing a holding pattern with an expiration protocol. And multiple passages suggest that expiration aligns with specific celestial or historical markers we're witnessing now. Here's where everything begins to escalate. Since the mid-20th century, unexplained aerial phenomena have surged globally. Governments that denied their existence for 70 years suddenly release classified footage. Objects demonstrating technology that violates known physics. Craft that move through air and water without propulsion systems we understand. The United States Pentagon confirmed in 2021 that these objects are real, their origins unknown. Detente un segundo. Why now? Why, after millennia of relative silence, do we see exponential increases in phenomena that ancient texts describe as divine or angelic manifestations? The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers descending on Mount Hermon in glowing vehicles. Modern witnesses describe luminous craft descending from the sky. The terminology changes. The phenomenon remains identical. But there's something even more disturbing. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 states the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. Also afterward. After the flood that was supposed to cleanse the earth. That phrase implies the bloodline wasn't exterminated. It adapted. It survived. It waited. Apocryphal sources like Jubilees and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs suggest remnants of the hybrid lineage persisted, hidden in remote regions, preserved under mountains, dormant until conditions allowed resurgence. What if the protocol wasn't just about the Watchers returning from below? What if it involved activating bloodlines that never fully disappeared? Sleeper genetics coded into humanity itself, waiting for the right frequency to awaken. The pieces aren't scattered anymore. They're assembling. And what they reveal isn't comforting. It's the blueprint of an ancient agenda resuming exactly on schedule.